So I think that that flows nicely next into Tess Yanisch's talk about economic impacts of COVID-19, because we've seen so many, as Jane talked about, so many parents had to take care of their kids during school shutdown. So Tess is going to talk about these economic impacts next. She's also a survey research associate at Consumer Reports. And take it away, Tess.
So I'm Tess. I'm going to be talking about the economic impacts of COVID-19 as seen through the AES. But I would actually like to start by setting the scene through a different study that Consumer Reports did. This was a not representative online qualitative study of Americans who had been financially affected by COVID-19 that we did in April 2020. And I feel like this particular quote shows a lot of what was happening in those early days of the pandemic. This is from Gregory, who is 41, had a reasonably high annual household income before the pandemic. The museum recently closed down due to the virus, and my promotional events are no longer in service for the same reason. I recently filed for unemployment, but I was told I cannot collect because I haven't worked there longer than 6 months. So we are relying solely on my girlfriend's check. So there's a lot happening there. And a lot of people had similar experiences. People who were working multiple jobs often lost one or more. At this point, a lot of states and local governments had lockdown orders, so people could not work and they were losing income. Even people who qualified to file for unemployment weren't seeing their unemployment yet because the huge volume of applications swamped everything. The federal government had recently passed a stimulus package that would increase the amount of unemployment and that would send checks directly to some Americans, but the impacts of that hadn't been felt yet. So a lot of people were in hard situations with reduced income. Our quantitative data from the AES bear this out. We asked in April of 2020 if people had experienced any of various things on the list due to COVID-19. We can see here some of the most common ones. 38% of Americans said they had experienced depression or anxiety. Almost 3 in 10 said that they had lost wages, salary, or self-employment earnings, some kind of income. 18% had to cut expenses to pay for mortgage, rent, or other essentials, and 8% had fallen behind on their mortgage or rent already. And this is, for most people, just one rent cycle after the lockdowns began. The really interesting story here is in the differences by income. If we look at the lowest income group, this dark green bar here, we can see that they are by far the most likely to have had to cut expenses to pay for mortgage or rent, or to already be behind on that. And perhaps because of these additional financial stressors, they're also considerably more likely to have experienced depression or anxiety than the other income levels. So while everyone was affected in some way, this group was much more likely to be affected in those particular ways. We also found differences by race and ethnicity. In particular, Hispanic Americans were the most likely to say they had fallen behind on mortgage or rent, and white Americans the least, perhaps because Hispanic Americans were the most likely to say they had lost income, and white Americans the least. And incidentally, we asked this question repeatedly across 2020, and the difference between Hispanic and white Americans in particular for having lost income was very consistent over time. Methodological note here, we asked this question over time. We asked it across 2020, and then we tried asking it a few times in 2021, but we realized the trending just didn't work. Again, the wording of the question was, which, if any, of the following have you experienced as a result of COVID-19? And I think that as the pandemic went on and people got out of the worst of it, they actually forgot which things they had experienced or reframed them in a more positive light, because we see things actually going down, in some cases by quite a lot, like for having lost income. So we cannot trend this question indefinitely. But back to April 2020. Because of the lockdowns, a lot of people were unable to work, but also they weren't going anywhere or spending as much money. So we asked people if they felt that they were saving more than they were losing more than they were saving, or if it was about the same. Now, Among Americans as a whole, roughly equal percentages said that they were losing more and saving more. But this was not consistent across the different groups that we looked at. Among those with the lowest annual household income, they were almost twice as likely to say that they felt they were losing more than that they were saving more, 34% versus 18%. And the opposite was true among those with the highest annual household income, where 37% said they felt like they were saving more than they were losing, and 19% felt like they were losing more than they were saving. Also consistent with the finding that Hispanic Americans were the most likely to say that they were losing income, they were considerably more likely to say that they felt they were losing more than they were saving. For white Americans, it was more or less the same. And for Black Americans, interestingly, at least at this point early on in the pandemic, they were more likely to say they felt that they were saving more compared to losing more. Jumping ahead to August of 2020, we knew these things about people's overall financial situation, but we wanted to know about how they were thinking about money. So we asked how their current spending habits compared with what they were before the pandemic. More than half of Americans, a little bit more than half, said that they were being more cautious. And that's actually remarkably consistent across the different income groups that we asked about. However, when we look at the percentage saying that they're much more cautious, there's a very clear gradient by annual household income. So out of all Americans, roughly 1 in 4 say that they were being much more cautious at this point in time. That was 1 in 3 among those with an annual household income of less than $30,000. And it was just 15% among those making $100,000 or more per year. So less than half. In December of 2020, 14% of Americans said they'd had a hard time paying for groceries in the past month. Consistent with other things that we found, that was much higher among Hispanic Americans, 23%. It was lowest among white and English-speaking Asian Americans. At this point, we were oversampling English-speaking Asians, so we were able to look at a little bit of information on them here. And Black Americans were in the middle. Also in December of 2020, we asked if anyone had received food free of charge, such as from a food bank, since the COVID-19 outbreak. More than 1 in 5 Americans had, and that was higher among Black and Hispanic Americans than English-speaking Asian or white Americans. Also, about half of these people had gone to a food bank for the first time since the COVID-19 outbreak. They had not had to do so beforehand. So a lot of these people are newly food insecure. The question that we asked in October of 2021 might shed some light on why that is. We asked Americans if they noticed a change in prices for various categories of goods and services over the past year. A majority had seen increases in all of the categories that we asked about, but they were most likely to report having seen increases on everyday necessities. So groceries and gas for your car. So not only were food prices going up, but so were the prices of other things where you might have to choose between that and food. And finally, in December 2021, we asked about financial situation again. A majority of Americans say that their financial situation is similar to what it was before the pandemic, but more than 1 in 5 still say that their situation is worse than it was before the pandemic. And again, that is considerably higher among those with the lowest annual household income, 32%, and just 13% among those with the highest annual household income. So the most vulnerable are getting hit the hardest. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tess.